On May 2nd, 2022, the trajectory of the Supreme Court probably changed forever. Politico published a draft of the court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson, and the draft of the majority opinion overturned Roe versus Wade and returned the issue of abortion to the states. Protesters quickly gathered outside the court. They engaged in all kinds of Handmaid's Tale histrionics, and watching the wailing and gnashing of teeth from inside the court was the author of the leaked draft opinion, Justice Samuel Alito. There had been leaks in the past. Sometimes reporters catch wind of what the court is preparing to rule in specific cases. And what judges were preparing to rule in Roe v. Wade in 1973 was leaked to a Time reporter. But a full draft opinion? That was unheard of. These drafts are incredibly sensitive. The only people with eyes on these drafts are clerks and the justices themselves. Supreme Court clerks sign confidentiality agreements to keep the court's work private, and they take not only one, but 2 oaths to dutifully execute the office. But the Dobbs draft got out. The court condemned the leak, but they didn't deny its authenticity, and they launched an investigation. An investigation which, by the way, never actually caught the leaker. Some on the left said this was actually a conservative leaking the opinion to keep pro-life pressure at bay while the court continues to do its work on the case. Does that pass the smell test at all? Or is it more likely that this leak was from the left to foment unrest in a last-ditch effort to get the court to back down? It wasn't long before protests mounted outside of conservative Supreme Court justices' homes. Left-wing activists revealed the addresses of the justices online, hoping to draw out more and more protesters, and every conservative justice on the court basically faced a mob at the front door. Amy Coney Barrett, who, while you might disagree with some of her rulings, is probably the sweetest lady on the planet, had to strap on a bulletproof vest in front of her children. Brett Kavanaugh had it the worst. Just over a month after the leak, Nicholas Roski was arrested near Justice Brett Kavanaugh's home. He had with him a gun, a knife, zip ties, and other gear that he was planning to use to break into the Kavanaugh's home and not only kill the justice, but his family. He plotted the family's annihilation. Nicholas Roski traveled all the way from Simi Valley, California, to take his shot at this. And he admitted this entire plot to his sister in a text message while he was in the Washington, D.C. area. And the sister did the right thing and called the police right away, and the plot was foiled. And if you want to know more about the depraved plot, just go check out the Wikipedia page, which calls Nicholas Roski Sophie Roski and gives Nicholas female pronouns because, shocker, Nicholas has since started identifying as a woman. What's really important about recording this history is that we get the pronouns of a delusional madman correct. Don't you dare dead name the man that wants you dead. Right. I'm glad we have our priorities straight. In hindsight, we should have seen where all this was tending. This is the judiciary. This is Article 3. This is the least political of the branches, the most private. And the left wanted them to live in fear for their lives. What did we think was going to happen to prominent conservatives in the more political branches when things heated up in the 2024 election? Last weekend marked the third attempt on President Donald Trump's life in less than 2 years. First in Butler, Pennsylvania, then in Florida, and most recently at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington, D.C. For its part, the conservative justices did not cave to the pressure or cower in fear. They overturned Roe v. Wade. And as for the president, he's continuing to fight, 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 just as he chanted from that stage in Butler, Pennsylvania, after the first attempt on his life came millimeters from ending it. There's perhaps no one who has traced the linkages between these events and the left's larger efforts to use lawfare to thwart conservatives on the bench or occupying elected office than Mollie Hemingway. Mollie has a new book titled Alito, the justice who reshaped the Supreme Court and restored the Constitution. But this book is so much more than a biography of Justice Samuel Alito, which is a feat in of itself because he is the quiet conservative on the court. Learning more about him is a great thing to do. But it's more a book about how the current court came to be, the successes and the failures of the conservative legal movement, and what our violent, turbulent present portends for the future of the court and the nation. Mollie Hemingway joins us on this week's episode of The Signal Sit Down, and we hope you enjoy. Before we get into this week's interview on the Signal Sit Down, ring that bell to get notifications on future Signal Sit Down content. Hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you may be joining us. And then while you're at it, please leave us a 5-star review and comment who you'd like to see on a future episode of the Signal Sit Down. Remember, it's your government. It's your country. And together, we're taking it back. Without further ado, here's the interview. Mollie Hemingway, welcome to the Signal Sit Down.
Great to be here with you, Bradley.
Of course, and you have a new book. It's sitting right here, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the Constitution. But before we get to the book, something crazy happened over the weekend, of course. A third assassination attempt on the president at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. You have followed these issues since they really started to crop up. What do you make of the latest assassination attempt against President Trump?
There is so much there, and I do understand that evil lurks within the hearts of all men. We're all sinful. We're all capable of doing bad things. But I think you can acknowledge that and also acknowledge that we have a particular problem at this moment in history with violence from the left, not just because it's happening a lot from the left to kill political opponents rather than reason with them or work through the natural process. But there's a lot of justification of it as well. I mean, what struck me, what was so disconcerting about this last guy is when he wrote his note to his family members about why he was doing this. He sounded exactly like a guest on MSNBC or CNN, or not even a guest necessarily, a host. You know, this is the type of rhetoric that we're seeing, extreme rhetoric based on falsehoods that is pervasive in our culture in the Atlantic Monthly, on Facebook. I mean, I didn't really see a big difference between some of my between what he was saying about his political views from my lefty friends and this. Now, obviously, the step to try to commit murder is an altogether different one, but I think we should all be aware that there is a problem. We have to be honest about it. And that doesn't mean denying that everyone is capable of great sin, but that we do have a particular problem where the left seems to embrace or support or not criticize the idea of killing political opponents.
And maybe it's a consequence of the digital media age. Maybe it's not. But I think one of the things that made it really clear to me how this one is different is this is a radicalization that's kind of happening in public. He's stripping lines straight from commentators on MSNBC, Hassan Piker, etc. Doesn't mean that they are necessarily at fault, of course, for the actions that this person undertook. But the kind of lucid, casual way in which he writes that manifesto, that letter to his family and friends, where he's just parroting points about Trump and the Epstein files that are proven false, of course, but parroting lines about Trump and the Epstein files that mainstream Democrats have been saying for a long time. There's this idea that radicalization has to happen on 4chan, that it happens in the dark underbellies of the internet, and it happens in isolation, when that's not the story that history tells. Radicalization can happen in the public square, and it can happen really quickly.
Well, it does frequently happen at the extremes, but as the base of the Democrat Party, including their media, their corporate media, become more radicalized, that means it's happening much more publicly and out and open. I saw that Chuck Todd said he was too scared to be at an event where Donald Trump is because so many people are trying to kill Donald Trump. And I thought it was interesting that Chuck Todd said this because one of the reasons given by this attempted assassin for wanting to kill Trump and his cabinet officials was that he believed Chuck Todd's conspiracy theory, the Russia collusion hoax. And few people did as much to advance that day after day after day as Chuck Todd. During the first Trump administration, every single time a Republican member of Congress or a Republican senator came on his Meet the Press show or whatever it was, he would ask them to address this conspiracy theory that he believed very deeply, which was that Donald Trump had conspired with Russia to steal the 2016 election. Now we have a guy who says he's killing Trump because he believed this conspiracy theory pushed by Chuck Todd himself and other prominent Democrat media figures. And to then say, oh, well, now I'm scared that I've made people so crazy that they're willing to do this type of behavior, it just struck me that Chuck Todd is the last person who should be talking about it, and the first person who should be talking about how irresponsible he was to push a delusional and insane conspiracy theory that undermined people's trust in the American Republic.
Yeah, and we had 3 different assassination attempts now against the president in the span of 2 years. I was at the Butler rally, the first one, earth-shattering, right? Just see everybody, especially on the grandstands behind the president. You know, there's that famous video of that guy looking out for where the assassin was. That was amazing to watch, but everybody else was just frozen in time, waiting to see whether or not the former president and obviously the leading candidate for the presidency was going to rise to his feet again. And when he put out that call to fight, 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 I think it fundamentally changed the course of the election. It also fundamentally changed how I think people with common sense started responding to these things. The president was really eloquent in his press conference after the attempt on his life at the White House Correspondents Association, saying, we can't let this stuff end our lives. I cannot not be the president. I want the ballroom, but I can't not be the president because of this threat. I need to be out there. I need to be talking to the people. And we can't let these types of threats, though we will combat them in every way, shape, or form possible, disrupt our everyday life, because that's what they want at the end of the day.
And yet, we also need to make sure that our government is doing whatever it can to take out left-wing terror networks. Mm-hmm. It's not just the president that they're trying to kill. They successfully killed Charlie Kirk. And the man who did it wasn't some lone wolf acting in complete isolation as an island from society. We know that he also was believing some of these conspiracy theories and messages of hate that are put out. You take the Southern Poverty Law Center. They put Charlie Kirk on their hate list. They've had a hate map where they target organizations, falsely accuse them of hatred. And then some people have used that information to commit violence against people and their organizations. You need to investigate this. It's not sufficient to say life must go on. Well, life in part goes on by respecting rule of law. And if you have major left-wing terror networks who are orchestrating, funding, conspiring to make life unsafe for anyone who's right of center, you also are obligated to root that out. And so that needs to happen. And there's a very limited window of opportunity to make that happen. And I hope that federal officials are understanding that just because they're okay with surviving these attempts doesn't mean the Republic can completely survive left-wing violence.
Yeah, and thankfully Todd Blanche confirmed yesterday to our Elizabeth Mitchell in the White House briefing room that they are going to be investigating any type of connection with these left-wing money groups. And you mentioned left-wing money groups. This is kind of where your book picks back up, where there were folks convinced by conspiracy theories propagated by these left-wing moneyed networks during the Kavanaugh hearings to threaten the justices. And then, of course, this all picks up speed with Dobbs. So take us inside your book. You start at the end of the Kavanaugh saga to talk about Justice Alito. Why do you do that?
Well, partly it just worked as a scene to open because Justice Alito was moving into former Justice Kennedy's chambers at the front of the court as the Kavanaugh confirmation had been finalized. When that was finalized, you had braying protesters, some of whom were arrested inside the Capitol building, some who went over to the Supreme Court to try to tear down these very large doors that they had no ability to tear down, climbing the statues. And they were saying from their improvised audio systems that they hoped people could hear them inside the court. And they could. It was very weird because we have branches of government that are subjected to political pressure, namely the executive branch and the legislative branch. The judicial branch is not supposed to be that way. They have lifetime appointments. Their pay is protected so that if congressmen get mad about how a decision has gone, they can't cut their pay and try to force them out that way. And yet the left, through these massive networks, has figured out that precisely because they aren't political animals, that's an opportunity to exploit for political machines. You have propaganda groups like ProPublica, which raised $53 million to go after the conservative members of the Supreme Court, namely Justice Alito and Justice Thomas. And they spent most of that money on that project, which is just an unbelievable sum where you can pay people who are willing to write in a certain way, research in a certain way, pretty big salaries to run a political operation.
Yeah, has anyone at the Federalist ever come to you and asked for $53 million for an investigative project?
I would be happy to work on something like that, but no.
If you had that type
never,
of capital, the answer would be yes.
Because if you did have that kind of investment, you could research so much more. You could report so much more about what's going on. This is a great example of how the left does organize this way. They think through, we want to undermine the integrity of the court. How will we do it? And one of their arms is their media arm. You point out the Kavanaugh situation. That was a conspiracy theory pushed by the Washington Post and the Atlantic and every major corporate media outlet on TV. It didn't, it might have been dreamed up of by actual Democrat activists, but it was done by the media. Same with the Russia collusion hoax. They were the ones who put this out there. And so the attacks on the court that we've seen, that's mostly been done by complicit media who share other left-wing activists' political views, and they also are frustrated that they don't control the court, and they want to, they want to take it over.
And it was shocking. It's shocking to me, especially on the heels of the whole Me Too movement, which really started to get exposed as fraudulent during the Kavanaugh confirmations and on to 2019 and 2020. But on the heels of the Me Too movement, how radicalizing for so many people the Kavanaugh confirmation saga was. There's a ton of people who walk around this building who are in college or just graduated young adults who saw what happened, looked into the allegations against Justice Kavanaugh, and were furious that every single time folks got on TV to talk about the issue, they say, Kavanaugh has been credibly accused. The credible accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, credible. Time and time and time again. And if you look into these allegations whatsoever, you find evidence is scant. There's nobody who's corroborating the story at the time. There's nothing there. And so this was incredibly radicalizing for a whole bunch of people in the conservative movement, younger people in the conservative movement. But was it radicalizing for Alito, sitting there and hearing this stuff?
Oh, there recently was a story about Sonia Sotomayor being very vicious and personal against Justice Kavanaugh. And one thing I thought spoke well of everybody involved was that it was Kavanaugh's colleagues who were more upset by that than Kavanaugh. I do think
Kavanaugh might have a thick skin at this point.
He does, and he's very forgiving, but his colleagues were appalled. This is not done. And I get into a lot of these types of stories, what's happening behind the scenes at the court. Traditionally speaking, it is totally fine to disagree vehemently with your colleagues on the court, and you're supposed to put that in your written opinion and your written dissent. And then, apart from that, you get along, and you speak well of each other in public. You always uphold the integrity of the court. What we've seen recently is as the 3 liberal justices have struggled with lack of control over the court, they've started to be publicly going after their colleagues, publicly undermining the integrity of the court. And I do think that's the type of thing. Alito was very bothered by what happened to Robert Bork. This literally was probably before you were born, when Reagan nominated the father of originalism, and he was treated so horribly that we now have the verb to bork, meaning to wrongly smear someone with false accusations. And he had to pull the nomination, or he didn't pass his vote. He stayed in through the end. And
47-53 or something like that.
He wanted to make them vote and show their dishonor in how they were voting on it. And for me, I'm of the age where I was radicalized by the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. That appalled me so much. And it also is why I've taken to writing about the Supreme Court. So after Clarence Thomas was confirmed, most people in America 100% believed him and thought the accusation that he'd told inappropriate jokes to a colleague just didn't hold up under scrutiny. And yet, what did the left do? They wrote books. They did movies. They kept writing magazine articles from their activist wing, trying to rewrite history. They will never let Thomas. They're angrier at Thomas for surviving their hit job than they are, than they were at the beginning. And so when Carrie Severino and I wrote the Kavanaugh book, we knew they would try to do that again. So we just thought, we just have to get the history out. We have to just tell the true story of what happened before they try to rewrite it. And also with Justice Alito, because he's such a giant figure on the court, but he's very humble, very reserved, as I believe Scalia said when he joined the court. When Alito joined the court, he said, "How remarkable, a shy Supreme Court justice." And yet he's secured some of the conservative movement's biggest victories at the court. And yet people don't know about him. And I think it's important for people to know his story, know what makes him who he is, understand how he was able to secure these victories. I mean, you take the overturning of Roe. That's something the conservative movement had tried to do for 50 years. And every time they'd come close, there would be Republican-appointed nominees who completely chickened out or would do something to avoid doing the hard thing. And with Justice Alito, he had the courage, both the moral courage and the physical courage, it turned out, to be able to keep a majority together. And I loved telling that story because it's not just about him. It's also about other key players in the movement, like the remarkable Solicitor General in Mississippi, who did such a great job of bringing that case. It wasn't even his case to bring. He just kind of got hired midway through. And he did a masterful job and showed such courage. I think when you see stories of courageous men, it helps inspire courage, the kind of courage we need across the movement.
100%, and a humility in that courage, right? And you said it. This book isn't just about Alito, and it's not just also about Dobbs. It is much more than that. It is a book about the conservative legal movement, its successes and its failures, and the formation of the Roberts Court and the intellectual threads, the ideologies competing for prevalence, for prominence on the court. I think I first became Alito-pilled when I read his dissent from Bostick. That was the first time where I had really gotten turned on to Alito's jurisprudence and started doing a little bit more research. And who is this Samuel Alito guy? Because I like a lot of what Scalia had to say. I like a lot of what Clarence Thomas has to say, both of them legends. But this Alito guy has something else to him that I really enjoy in reading his court opinions, and also just isn't so much about the textualism and the originalism. He's really about being prudent.
Yes.
And connecting Supreme Court jurisprudence to an enduring moral order that I think really comes from the Declaration of Independence. And I think that's what kind of separates his jurisprudence apart from Thomas and Scalia. And, you walk around this conservative movement and the divide amongst the normies is, are you Scalia-pilled or are you Thomas-pilled? Some people are both. That's totally fine. There's a large overlap in the middle for the Venn diagram. But Alito, was he underrated before Dobbs? His star is rising right now, it feels like. You mentioned the public polling that suggests Alito is one of the lesser-known Supreme Court justices. What is happening with the Alito pill?
I love everything you said. I feel like I'm going to steal some of this when I'm talking about him. This is kind of how I came to write it. And if I can just say personally, I am, forgive me, from a libertarian background. So I am so used to...
We all were.
So I was just obsessed with Scalia. I was obsessed with Thomas. I'm still obsessed with Thomas.
Me too.
They are liberty-minded in a way, libertarian-minded in a way that Alito is really the conservative on the court. He is the conservative. So you have 5 people with originalist, they self-identify as originalists. And that just means you believe that the Constitution should be interpreted according to its original meaning, not whatever you're feeling like on a given day. But within those 5, you have big variations. I think it's fun to explore those variations. You mentioned Bostock, which was, I think Gorsuch is a fantastic justice. That was a horrible decision that he did, and I have no problem saying that as much as I can. I mean, he said that when the Civil Rights Act was passed, that the people who passed that intended it for, or he says it also includes trans people. You can't have different standards for men who identify as women and women, actual women, and it's ludicrous. It's preposterous. I hope he knows that by this point. Alito calls him out, and quite beautifully. I mean, they're friends, but he does not respect that opinion. He said it, in his dissent, and he's also spoken about it publicly as well.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in the book they agree on 80 to 85% of cases, but that 15%, That's where the excitement is.
Yes.
That's where the fun part is.
Yes. Well, and it's also very significant. As Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, said after that Bostock decision came down, he said, if this is what we were fighting for in putting originalist members on the court, then, I'm out. This is not what I was for. So a bad decision, particularly this is before Roe is overturned. And everyone's waiting for Roe to be overturned for something to finally happen there. And then they're getting bad decisions like this. They're beginning to wonder, what is it all for? Now, I want to say another thing. The Alito book comes about in part because when I was working on that Kavanaugh book with Carrie Severino, even Alito's colleagues were thinking it was weird that nobody talks about Alito. They're like, he's the giant on this court. He's brilliant. He does things that nobody else can do. He's amazing in oral argument. He writes these masterpieces, and yet nobody talks about him. It's because he's the opposite of a celebrity justice. He's not appearing on Broadway or going to the Grammys or giving flowery speeches. He just does his work humbly, keeps his head down, and moves on. But to me, a man like that is worthy of knowing more about, honoring for, whatever good traits you can see there, and emulating in whatever way is possible. But I just have to say, Bradley, that there is a certain type of conservative attorney in town who has been saying to me for years, it's Alito, it's Alito. Everybody talks about Scalia and Thomas, but it's Alito. And I think they're all great. And I think they all, and in fact, I also think they all worked together well, and that Thomas and Alito continue to work together well, precisely because they have some differences that play off each other nicely.
Well, and we'll get into Alito's background in just a second, but that humility that he comes to the court with, he's not that is the classical archetype of the judge. That is what even, St. Augustine is writing about, with the tortured mind of the judge has to be kind of focused on himself and cloistered in a way to consider these high-minded principles of law, but also learn about the particulars and be able to reconcile those two things. I mean, that is he is not Sonia Sotomayor. He is not Ketanji Brown Jackson. He is not the notorious RBG in this way.
He's also not a John Roberts.
Right.
So he came on the court soon after John Roberts became Chief Justice. And I thought it was interesting to explore some of that story as well, how John Roberts comes onto the court. Also how the conservative movement seems to think he's conservative, even though he has never once claimed to be. And in fact, there were clues that maybe he wasn't. Someone said,
the outright denial of any sort of jurisprudent philosophy in his confirmation hearing.
Yeah, he testified under oath. He had no judicial philosophy. Mm-hmm. He also, when people said, I think he's affiliated with the Federalist Society, that could not be a more moderate group of libertarians and conservatives. He's like, I was never associated with them. But Chief Justice John Roberts, who has many admirable qualities and also some less admirable qualities, one of the latter there would be that he cares a great deal what the media thinks, and he's able to be bullied by the media. And one of the problems with being political like that, when if Barack Obama says the integrity of the court is in question if you rule the way that the Constitution would require on Obamacare, and Roberts finds that compelling. But judges don't make good politicians. They just don't. If they ever ran a campaign, it was the one that, for instance, Chief Justice John Roberts ran to get onto the Supreme Court. But that's a little different than all other political campaigns, and just one success does not really mean that you understand the political atmosphere. And also, it's completely incongruous with the role of a judge. Mm-hmm. So they're bad at it when they do politics, and it's also not what judges are supposed to do anyway.
Yeah, and you mentioned conservative lawyers lean in and say, it's Alito, it's Alito, it's Alito. And then it comes time to do the big thing, the big payoff, overturn Roe, write the opinion in Dobbs. And in that moment, Thomas also leans in and says, it's Alito. It gives me John Adams insisting that Thomas Jefferson be the author, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence to me.
Yes.
It feels very similar, where Thomas says, no, it has to be Alito who writes this Dobbs opinion. Take us inside that drafting process. You have some great information in the book about what it was like to navigate the politics properly understood of going about overturning Roe.
Right. So there are so many things that I love getting into in the book just about the process of a case coming to be heard before the court. And one of the hurdles you have to overcome, you have to have 4 justices agree to hear a case. And there is a little bit of strategy involved with that. Some people might want to hear a case because they think it's time to shore up a certain understanding or time to overturn a precedent. You have to think about who's on the court and whether you will be able to do that, whether a loss on a given issue is something that you can withstand as part of the process of a long-term goal of overturning a bad precedent. And so there is a lot of backstory about how the case was granted cert, as we say, which means that the court was agreeing to hear it. But what happens is they agree to hear the case and in 2021, and they don't announce it for a few months. But everybody on the court knew that's what was happening. They're hiring clerks who might be particularly well suited to help with the task of overturning Roe. Oral arguments are held December 1st of that year. And shortly after oral arguments are held, the justices all meet together, just the 9 justices, nobody else, not any staff, no clerks, just the justices.
Which is rare in Washington, in any branch of government, yes.
I actually think that's why leaks are rare at the Supreme Court. Most people leak to try to show people that they're important. But if you're at the court, whether you are a justice, a clerk, or a staff member, everybody knows you're important and have access to important things. You don't need to leak to show how important you are. But they have the 5 votes to overturn Roe. They have 6 votes to uphold the Mississippi law in question. And so Roberts, this is very typical Roberts, he would have voted to uphold the law but not overturn Roe. And he was frustrated that they were even being asked to overturn Roe. Well, the person who has the seniority in the group doing the big thing, the person who has the seniority, he's the one who gets to decide who will write the opinion. And Thomas already had a really big case. One of his great legacies on the court has been how he has preserved gun rights and worked to make sure that the court upholds the Constitution in that regard. He had a big gun rights case. And he also understood that every previous time an abortion case had the chance of overturning Roe, something fell apart at the last minute. You know, most famously in Casey, they had the votes. That was Casey v. Planned Parenthood in 1992. They had the votes to overturn Roe. And then 3 Republican-appointed justices, that would be Sandra Day O'Connor, David Souter, and Anthony Kennedy, they all formed a little troika to preserve Roe. They couldn't withstand...
2 Reagan appointees.
Yes.
And an H.W. appointee.
Yes.
All appointed right as the conservative legal movement is starting in earnest. So
yes.
Bookmark that, audience. We'll come back to it later.
Yes. So it had to be someone who could keep the majority together. So this is one of the ways that I think the difference between Thomas and Alito, their differences are interesting. Thomas has this incredibly admirable quality of saying, well, here's where we should be. And that's where I stand. And I don't really care if the rest of you figured it out yet because this is where we should be. So he plants his flag and he doesn't worry so much about the means of he cares about the court deciding the right way. But Alito frequently agrees with Thomas about where things should be, but he thinks more pragmatically, okay, so we want to be over there. How do we get there? We're certainly not getting all the way over there this year. So what's a good step we can take so that the next time we hear a case, we can then take another step and another step. The left has understood this about Alito long before the right did. The left was terrified of Alito.
This comes out in his dissents a lot, too, where he's trying to create some solid foundation to go back and challenge these things. But what you're talking about here is incrementalism. And this incrementalism often gets a bad rap by people who, how do the kids say it? Understand what time it is, know what time it is. I am not somebody who wants to tear everything down. I just think that there's a lot of people in the conservative movement who don't have the proper sense of urgency. I think what separates Alito's incrementalism from somebody like, let's say, Justice Roberts' incrementalism is Alito does his homework to make sure that the next case that's heard has really solid footing to take the next step, whereas poorly thought out incrementalism,
it's just a mush.
It's either a mush or it adopts left-wing priors of constitutional jurisprudence to get to that next step. And then you have to kind of reinvent the wheel all over again to get there.
Exactly right. Yes. And Alito is also very generous with a group decision. So he writes very carefully. He's a very beautiful writer, but he doesn't get upset if someone wants to include something that he wouldn't have written that way. He works with a majority. And so there was a lot of speculation later on in that term that there had been trouble keeping the majority together. It's actually not true. They were together at the beginning. They stayed together until the end. There wasn't trouble there. And in fact, when Alito distributes his opinion to the entire court, he does this in early February. So when you draft an opinion, you're supposed to share it with everybody. And he does. And within 5 minutes, Gorsuch writes back, all good, I'm in. And that's when the left realizes, oh, they were working on this before this first distribution. So by getting the input from the different chambers about what each person wanted, and sometimes it's tricky. Justice Thomas has very particular views about the 14th Amendment that I actually think are right, but the court has done so much for so long in a different direction that you would lose the other justices if you leaned too far into that. But he handles it really well and keeps everybody on board, and it works.
And all of this almost doesn't happen because Alito is this close to being a factory worker for his entire life. He is brilliant. People understood that from a very young age. But he gets a scholarship at the last moment to actually invest in this Ivy League education that he received. He went to Princeton and then he went to Yale. Tell us about how Alito's upbringing informs his jurisprudence. Because so much that Clarence Thomas has this great autobiography. The title is escaping. Is it My Father's Son?
My Grandfather's Son.
My Grandfather's Son. And it talks about his life and how that informed his view of constitutional jurisprudence. How do we get Supreme Court Justice Alito when we were so close to not having that?
So a big part of that story is actually about his father, also named Samuel Alito. And it was his father who almost was a factory worker before he got that scholarship to attend college. And it is true that our Samuel Alito, that 75%, I think, of the graduates of his high school did go on to factory or secretarial work. He was a complete outlier in this environment in where he grew up in the suburban areas outside of Trenton. But he said in his confirmation hearings that he is who he is because of his parents. And I would say his father in particular. His father was an immigrant from Italy as an infant. All four of his grandparents were immigrants from Italy. They hadn't all been of remarkable background. In fact, they were very poor farmers on the one side. His father shows promise and gets this great opportunity, and that works out very well for him. But he inculcates in his children, along with his wife, that they need to focus on education. And so both Alito and his sister become very prominent attorneys, and they both were instructed by these parents who had strong values, very strong home life, and just lived by example. Sam Alito's father was the nonpartisan person at the New Jersey legislature who helped both the Republicans and the Democrats. He single-handedly redistricted after a Supreme Court ruling saying that the way New Jersey allocated their Senate seats was unconstitutional. Bad ruling, but he did the work, and he did it so well and with so little nobody knew what his politics were. Sam Alito didn't know what his own father's politics were. And so he gets a lot of these traits from his parents, from his father. But what I think is remarkable about it is that Sam Alito does go to elite institutions. He goes to Princeton. He goes to Yale Law. He works for the Reagan administration. He becomes a U.S. attorney. And yet he never changes who he is. He is the same solid, values-based person who cares about the country when he begins and where he is now. A lot of people, if they're given the opportunity to be educated at Princeton or Yale, they moderate, they squish, they start having friendships that make it hard for them to be as courageous as they would like to be. It's just not Alito. He just stays exactly the same. And I've noticed this in D.C. Sometimes people will thank me for not changing. And I think, what a weird compliment, But then I realized so many people do come to D.C. one way, and then they change. They forget why they came, what their values are, and it should not be so remarkable when someone doesn't change, but it is certainly remarkable how Alito has withstood pressures that most of us could not and not changed.
This is an interesting point, especially as it pertains to the crop of students at Yale Law School coming up in the early and mid-'70s. I mean, these are people who define American life for a generation. He's there while Justice Thomas is there. Justice Thomas is not the same person that he was when he graduated Yale Law School. He was a rebel. I think there's a portion in your book where you mention how Alito was intimidated by Thomas on Yale's campus because Thomas was wearing like black work boots and overalls and just...
It was scary.
A scary looking guy.
Yeah, sometimes Thomas will tease him like, why were you not better friends with me? And he's like, you were scary at that time.
and the Clintons.
Yep.
Bill and Hillary Clinton are both in there at the time. Robert Reich is there at the time. These are people who would define the 90s to now of American political life. What's in the water at Yale at the time?
Whatever was in the water, it's actually worse now. And this is one of the things that I think is worth remembering, that the conservative legal movement got started not just to fix the judiciary, but to fix the law schools. And that clearly has not happened. We have a major problem at our law schools. You recently had a situation where the UCLA Federalist Society hosted a talk that wasn't able to proceed because the law students have rejected everything about the law and about reasoned debate in favor of power politics and emotion and shouting down people who you don't agree with. That's the crop that we're getting now. So bad, actually, that there were federal judges, a number of them, who said they'll no longer take students from Yale Law. And that's one of the top law schools in the country.
The majority of the court right now is Yale educated, I believe. Yeah. Because that was one of the shifts that happened a few years ago, where it went from plurality Harvard to plurality Yale.
Yes.
And now Notre Dame is ascendant.
Well, and it should, because Notre Dame does uphold some of these principles. I talk in the book about how there are these different standards for the different justices. If you're a liberal justice, you can literally appear on Broadway. You can go to the Grammys. You can party with Beyonce. You can just have all these elite friendships and travel, and nobody says a word. And if they do say a word, it's to praise you. And if you're a conservative justice, you basically can't leave your home without protection for fear of being killed. You can't really have a properly functioning Supreme Court with that disparity. And the liberal justices get to go to Yale Law School and Harvard, and the red carpet is rolled out for them. It's not the same story for the conservative justices. Now, one top law school that is different is Notre Dame. They invite both the liberals and the conservatives. They protect them. They have standards for their students that include not behaving like violent activists, regardless of, where they are. And they've benefited from that.
Yeah. I went to Cal, so I know the bad side of that. My wife went to Notre Dame, so it's totally stolen valor on my part when I say go Irish. But it's always fun to go back to campus and talk to people who are friends of ours who are enrolled in the law school there and just see how rich their legal education is, as opposed to some of the friends that I know in the conservative movement who previously graduated from Harvard Law and just say, I was completely unprepared. And even Alito makes reference to this even back in the 70s, where Yale or Princeton is kind of thrown into the tumult of Vietnam. And then at Yale, he has this totally absent constitutional law professor. He wants to go into Bork's class, but he's unable to do so. And so he kind of graduates Yale Law School saying, I was completely self-educated on the issue of constitutional law. If that's self-education, then I think we need to completely reevaluate what we think about the law schools.
I love that humility that he has. But that story about what happened at Princeton, I think, is also relevant for the current moment. He goes to Princeton as a public school kid. Most people who went there went to elite boarding schools. He is surprised when he gets there and realizes he thought he would be really struggling to keep up with the other students. And instead, he's not very impressed with their academic skills. And then when the protest movements start happening at Princeton, they started later there because it was considered a more conservative school, but they really get going to the point that they just cancel the semester. Alito, who has worked very hard to be where he is extremely frustrated. He's there to learn. And the way he sees these fellow students and faculty, it's that they are privileged. they can riot for a couple years and still get a cushy job somewhere. He doesn't have that background.
Right.
He understands what the middle class and lower class go through at the hands of elites better than many other people in his type of position. And he cares about it, not just like at Princeton, he cares about what happened to Trenton and Newark. He knows that they used to be good cities where you could raise a family. And he sees how elite liberals enact policies that make it hard for the middle class to live there, that make living as a lower class person a violent and unstable situation. And he doesn't like just cast it aside because he lives in some elite community. To this day, he doesn't live in an elite community.
So this is a good time to talk about the formation of the conservative legal movement and the, I guess you could say, early late stage Roberts Court. Roberts is 71. We don't know how long he's going to stay, but this is kind of, I feel like this is kind of the apotheosis of the Roberts Court in some ways. FDR can't pack the court, but he can appoint it. He appoints 9 justices. At the end of his term, 8 of them are FDR judges. The one that was a Remainer, a bitter clinger from the Hoover administration, is replaced by Truman in 1945. So you have liberal domination, like 9-0 domination of the court from the FDR administration all the way until the early 70s. Eisenhower appoints Chief Justice Earl Warren. Earl Warren is a Republican from California. You know, what what you make of that, please let me know. But this is right before the conservative legal movement starts in earnest. So describe for us what the playing field is when we come to the early to mid 70s for conservatives in the area of constitutional law. This is when Alito is in law school.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting in part because we say things now in terms of Republican or Democrat, but some of the streams of judicial thinking don't map nicely onto that. Now, I would say we're strongly influenced by even Woodrow Wilson. He is open about his opposition to the Constitution. He views it as a restraint on what he would like to be able to do with progressivism. That starts taking root throughout the country. It's in that environment that FDR is able to enact so much. And he's very frustrated because he's trying to pass legislation. The Supreme Court is overturning a lot of it as unconstitutional. So people start talking about judicial restraint. This idea that you should let Congress or other legislatures, you should let them do what they, you should defer to the will of the people and not try to fix everything. So at first, that's kind of a progressive view because it's the conservatives who are opposing the FDR agenda. Once they have complete and utter domination of the court, they all kind of flip. Instead of being into restraint, they become activists. So they're beginning to get frustrated that the American people aren't putting into law what they would like them to. So they just declare it from the bench. And we do see that just keeps growing for decades. And it's a real problem. I think we all know about Roe v. Wade, where they just legislate something that doesn't even pretend to be the law. And people on left and right agree with that at the time. They just legislate and they say, oh, yeah, it's hidden in here somewhere. We're frustrated that people aren't voting to allow people to end the lives of unborn children. So we'll just say that it's in there. And it's a joke, and it decreases the legitimacy of the court to have that kind of opinion. But they do that on all sorts of things.
Even RBG notes, yes.
Yeah, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought it was not a good decision. No, nobody respectable really ever tried to defend it at any point. But there were a few people who did stick to judicial restraint, this idea that you should defer to the people through their legislatures. Alito is strongly influenced by this idea. And he doesn't do it for political reasons, but because he actually thinks that's the role of the court. But in that milieu, again, you start having conservatives say, this is getting to be crazy. They're not even pretending to be judges. You have sitting Supreme Court justices saying things like, I just decide what I think, and then I see if other people ever agree with me. Or the only rule I care about is rule of 5. They don't care about having a coherent philosophy. They just want the power. So the conservative legal movement does really get going at that time with that originalist, constitutionalist view of how things should be interpreted, but also developing other schools of thought about, most of the cases before the court are statutory, not constitutional, just about laws that have been passed. So how do you interpret statutes? How do you do it in a faithful and consistent way?
How do you take judicial restraint, make it something that can actually combat the excesses of the Warren Court and the liberal progressive domination that had really taken over the Article III branch. But we get to early 70s, it starts to swing back in the other direction because of Nixon. There's all this like scrambling to figure out, okay, how do we actually cement the gains here?
I mean, kind of,
yeah,
but also kind of not. I mean, one of the big things that Carrie Severino and I covered in the previous book on Kavanaugh was what a poor job many Republican presidents had done. You just mentioned Eisenhower, who famously said that his two worst mistakes were sitting on the Supreme Court. Well, no surprise. He was picking people for political reasons. He picked Warren to thank him for stepping out of the Republican nominating race.
right.
Not because he thought he would be a good judge, and he turned out to be horrible. He picked someone else because he thought it might help him win Democrats in the Northeast. It's something to keep in mind about the current court when people complain about it, that it was not that long ago that you had really bad picks.
Oh, it was terrible.
And even Reagan picks people based on identity politics. He doesn't vet them. You have, George H.W. Bush, who has hit the best pick on the court, imaginable in Clarence Thomas, but also David Souter. That was easily his biggest mistake after the handling of the Iraq War. And you just see people being all over the place. Trump actually does do a good job, I think, of vetting candidates according to who can get confirmed that year. So sometimes people say, well, why don't we appoint this, hard-charging stalwart? Well, you've got a majority of 51.
The Senate sucks.
And 2 people have already said they're not going to vote for you. So how are you going to get them through if you get someone even more?
Right. Yeah, and this is where I'm driving. So
okay.
It starts to shift a little bit in the 70s, but there's no infrastructure. There's no support system to actually try to solidify anything real. Conservative legal movement, Federalist Society comes around in 82, but in those 70s, the 70s into the early 80s, there's a lot of jockeying of how are you going to take the law schools back, as you mentioned? How are you going to take the judicial branch back? And the conservatives, these originalism-minded conservatives, start to have a larger sway over the process. But you mentioned it. Reagan has 4 appointments to the court: O'Connor, Scalia, he has Rehnquist and Kennedy, and then H.W. has Souter and Thomas. So you have those 6 justices from the early 80s into the early 90s. Conservative legal movements on the scene, and they're batting about 500. And I think that kind of, you can say it continues to the present day of batting 500. I think the Trump justices, jury's still mostly out on some of them because they've been here and there on some things. For example, Amy Coney Barrett ruling with the Biden administration on some issues. Gorsuch, obviously his Bostock opinion, but he's also been solid on some other constitutional issues. But in the George W. Bush administration, you have Roberts and you have Alito. So in totality, the conservative legal movement is batting about 500. You can be incredibly frustrated with that if you are an urgency-minded conservative. You think that the republic is on the brink. I'm in that position. But I also, it's not a recency bias, it's an urgency bias, but I have to keep in mind that 50 years ago, we were nowhere. What do you make of the successes and failures of the conservative legal movement over these last 50 years?
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of this person I interviewed who spent, I'm not joking, 45 minutes absolutely trashing the Chief Justice, John Roberts. And he really thought he was awful. And at the end of it, he says, now I do have to admit, if you had told me that we would have 6 conservative justices appointed to the court and Roberts wasn't the best, he was the worst, I would have cheered for joy back in 2005. And I do think people lose that perspective somewhat. You do have a solid Supreme Court. Where you have the issue, I think, is in something else you just said, the urgency issue. This is where you're seeing conflict between Alito and Thomas on the one hand and the younger justices on the other, particularly Kavanaugh and really Barrett. It's not that they disagree that much. It's that they disagree about how much time they have to fix the problems And there are so many problems that have to be fixed and how urgent it is. So Barrett has said, and I think I think her reasoning is usually quite defensible. She's very good at statutory interpretation. She has not the sense of urgency that I would like to see from a justice at this moment in our country's history.
Also came from the academy. Yeah.
And take Thomas. He thinks that if there is an injustice, it should be corrected as soon as you can because people suffer under that injustice. So you take a thing like Plessy v. Ferguson that lasted for 50 years and an entire system built up around this idea that the races should be separate. People suffer under bad court decisions. And to say, oh, we need more time to consider these things, it's frustrating for people who are suffering. And people should think about that and also recognize that, yes, there's an originalist, constitutionalist majority on the court right now, but how long is that going to last? Things can change. Alito and Thomas know because they have been on courts that weren't where they were the minority. They know that things are fleeting, and they think that people should work while they have the time to work. It's more an issue of pace. And also, I think there's a little bit of an issue of courage, too. It takes courage to withstand the unbelievable onslaught from the media and other activists. And you do have to kind of develop that. And people who had the lives that Alito and Thomas had naturally develop some courage. But everyone needs it.
But there does seem to be courage developing in the post-Dobbs leak world. I thought Amy Coney Barrett's decision in Trump v. Casa on the nationwide injunctions question was really well reasoned, really sharp, and it was a courageous thing for her to do. How does, silver lining of every terrible thing that happened after the leak, the assassination, there's the assassination attempt on Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett's having to wear a bulletproof vest, so many terrible things. But is there a silver lining here that there is more courage amongst the justices, the conservative justices on the Supreme Court in response to that?
I think they have been vetted for that to some extent, and it shows. And each of the justices who signed on to Dobbs to be able to withstand threats, not just on their own lives, but on their spouses and their children. I think that's something we should all think about ourselves. We need to be courageous even when it costs us spouse, home, children. You read, there's a, hymn that we sing in my church about even if they take all of these things, God endures and is a stronghold. So you have to have that attitude going into it. And I do think that they are that way. I also want to just say something about Roberts. I think of all the justices, he's the one that gets the most criticism, and for good reason. But people forget, he tends to be in the majority, the vast majority of the time. He's still an important player. And just because he's a squish on things that some people care about doesn't mean he's a squish on all things. Think about the courage he showed in leading the court to fight racism through affirmative action. That was something that he really is, he's the giant on that. And so it's worth remembering that as much as you might want to complain about people, you shouldn't forget that they are also quite strong.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of people tends to knock Roberts, is that he is quick to fold sometimes. He is susceptible to pressure, specifically pressure from the left on matters of politics.
Which only gives you more pressure. I think that's
right.
The problem. They think that they're being so brilliant about it, but actually it just means, oh, hey, we can pressure him. We'll do more of this media activism.
Yes. And that is why everything that happened with the court, from the Kavanaugh hearing through the Dobbs leak, should have been this massive red flag to everybody on what could happen in the 2024 election with all these different assassination attempts, of course, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, etc. Like, this was what they were doing to the quote-unquote non-political branches of government. Wait until you see what they're going to do to people when they are out in the public square engaging in the Article 1 and Article 2 political process. But if you look at Roberts in particular, I mean, there's kind of one thing that I have. He has this view of institutionalism that actually politicizes the court, because it's not just based on the decisions. It's kind of all based on the politicking, which, of course, there is real politicking that happens on the court. But he thinks that the legitimacy is derived by this type of perception rather than the constitutional correctness of the decisions. And the idea that you can separate those two things is where I think he gets himself into a lot of trouble. Do you think, with the way things are going on the court now, that he is ever going to change in that respect? Or is it going to be a lot of 5-4 with Roberts kind of on the outs?
Right. I mean, that is what's interesting about the current court. He's no longer as important as he used to be. You look at Kennedy. He used to be so important because he was so willing to move one direction or another to whoever persuaded him. So people were always making him the central figure in what was a majority opinion. Well, Roberts used to be more important. Now with 5 originalist justices, he's less important. But I also want to make just one point really quickly. There are a lot of, like you said, we refer to it as the Roberts court. And that's true. We have always referred to courts by who is the Chief Justice at that time. But that is a role that is mostly administrative. Mm-hmm. It's almost entirely administrative. In fact, I will say it's entirely administrative. It's the same. He has the same vote as Ketanji Brown Jackson. He does set meeting times. He does, have a lot of bureaucratic responsibilities with the judicial branch. But it doesn't mean that they have any opinion influence on the court. And he does seem to be fairly stuck in his ways. I actually find it admirable that he cares about the reputation of the court. I just think he's very bad at understanding how the reputation works, and that people who are justices do not make good politicians. That's a good thing. Mm-hmm. But when they try to be political, they just usually fail miserably. They think, if I succumb to Obama's pressure, that'll make the left see that we are more respectable. No, it just makes the left see that you are able to be bullied, and they will do it more and more. We saw it with Chuck Schumer, then the minority leader, actually threaten violence against Kavanaugh and Gorsuch from the steps of the Supreme Court. And yes, Roberts and pretty much everybody came out and immediately condemned it, even people on the left. But when you sort of open yourself up to politicking, it's just a one-way ratchet for the most part.
Well, a one-way ratchet, that's exactly right. My final question for you, I mentioned the Trump v. Casa case, the nationwide injunctions being severely limited by the majority of conservatives on the court. You have paid more attention to anyone in our field of the lawfare that the left engages in, the one-way ratchet, and it's taking on more formal. It's more decentralized. There's all sorts of lawfare happening all around the country. It's not just a few major cases, and it's also becoming more formalized. Right? There's processes and there's memorandums being held, passed around telling people, here's how you challenge the Trump administration properly in court. What is the future of lawfare with the Supreme Court as it's currently constituted and this new limitation on the nationwide injunctions?
I actually love you bringing up this case because it's a great example of how Alito and Barrett differ. I personally think that most of the problem with public opinion about Barrett is not that she's so bad, but that she was pitched as that she was going to be the best justice you'd ever seen in history. So people had extremely high expectations, and they've been a little disappointed. But usually what she writes is quite defensible, as it was in Casa. But you might remember what Alito said at that time, which is, this is, like he agreed with the decision. He was definitely on that side of things, but he was worried that the restrictions put in place had loopholes so big you could drive Mack trucks through them, and that the left, which was using lawfare as a means to subvert the will of the people through a duly elected president, that would continue. And it took, like a few weeks for him to be proven right. So they tend to agree, but I would say Alito sees that sometimes you need to be courageous and extremely clear about what you're saying, whereas Barrett seems to take more of that Roberts approach of what's the least we can do to kind of send a message about where we want things to be without saying too much. So it's not like horrible, but it can result in continued lawfare. And lawfare against the people, which is what this is. And it's coordinated, it's the only thing that's really working for the left, that does harm people. You elect someone and they get 4 years. You take away 2, 3, or 4 years of that 4-year term, that is harming the people. We are a self-governed people. We need to be able to have our laws executed by the president. We need to have a Congress that functions properly. And when you constrain those things through bad Supreme Court decisions or through lawfare or whatever, it's a harm against the people. It's not really about Trump or whoever the next president is, Democrat, Republican. It's about the people.
The book is Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the Constitution. Mollie Hemingway, thank you for coming on The Signal Sit Down.
Thank you, Bradley.
Thank you so much for tuning into The Signal Sit Down. If you liked what you heard here today, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever before you go. And we love your feedback. It really does help the show. So please remember to leave us a review and comment who you'd like to see on future episodes of The Signal Sit Down. It's because of your support and your interest and your engagement that allows us to continue this incredibly fun work. And together, we'll continue to expose how Washington really works and affect real change. We'll see you next time on The Signal Sit Down.